Today, we're going to take a look at pre-compositions and why you might want to use them in After Effects. So I've built this small animation in After Effects that sort of transitions between a few different scenes where we have shapes moving onto the composition. This is a good example of somewhere where you might want to use a pre-composition to keep your animation organized, but also to make things like scene transitions a little bit easier. So to start, I'm just going to make a new composition. I'm going to call this pre-comp demo. 1920 by 1080 is fine. Around 30 frames per second is fine. 5 seconds is fine. So I'll build my first scene here, which is going to be that circle dropping into the frame. I'll first want to give myself a background, so I will double click on the rectangle here, and I'll just change that color. I have a few swatches off screen here that I'm using to select these colors. I'll go ahead and name this and just give that a lock. So to start with, I'm going to go ahead and draw my circle. I'll make this a color that stands out against the background, and I'm going to make this fairly large. I'm going to go ahead and center this up with my composition. And about here is where I eventually want to end up. I'll place this at about frame 15 and keyframe my position. And I'm going to go ahead and separate my dimensions now, just because I know I'm not going to be animating the X position on this. And I'll rename this circle. I'll start my bounce off canvas. And I can already see right now that my origin point has not been centered up in the shape. So just really quickly before I get too far, I'm going to go to Layer, Transform, Center Anchor Point in Layer Content. What that will do will move this slightly up. You'll see this has adjusted some things here. I'm going to go ahead and redo my positioning just to make sure that's nice and clean and I'm not accidentally animating that anchor point. Let's keyframe that there. And then at the very start, I'm going to make sure that this starts off canvas. And then somewhere in between, I'll want this to come down to some sort of floor position and then bounce back up. I'll go ahead and jump into my graph view. I want to make sure that this is a nice clean bounce. And so I will first select my keyframes. And then I'll just easy ease these to start with. And then I will break these handles and create a more typical bounce shape. I'm gonna make sure this handle doesn't go past the bottom here. Let's take a look at that. Oh, that's really fast. This needs to be much more than just a few keyframes at the end here. It's a little better. I'll go ahead and add another keyframe where this can fall back down to the floor. And make sure this is somewhere in the middle. Doesn't have to be perfect, but relatively even is helpful. Okay, so we'll make this our first scene. Going to right click. I'm going to add these layers into what's called a pre-composition, and it really adds them to like a new group. So essentially, I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to go to pre-compose. It asks me what I want to call that. I'll call this circle scene 1. Hit OK. And you'll see it adds this to its own layer. And then it also creates this circle scene 1 composition up here in our project panel. If I hit tab on my keyboard, you can see how these pre-compositions are nested within each other. If I double click on this and I come in here, you'll see that I have all of my properties that I've animated. But if I back out to our main composition, There are no keyframes set on this thing. It's like a nested element. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and actually duplicate this scene from my project panel just so I can have some keyframes that help me mark my timing. I'll name this square scene 2. Jump in here. So this is actually a totally separate composition. I'm just using this as a reference point. You'll see why in just a second. But it'll help me have a reference for sort of the size and timing of things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my background color here. And then I'll add a new shape layer. This one is going to be our square. And I'll make this a relatively similar size to our circle. Something like that is pretty close. Our circle will need to overshoot our square a little bit to look like a similar size. And then I'll change the color of this. And just for now, I'm going to leave that circle layer on there. I'll go ahead and center this up in our composition. I'll start to keyframe my position animations here. I'm also going to rename this. And I'm going to use these other keyframes as timing references. So I'm just going to go ahead and throw a keyframe in at all these spots that I have it on the circle. And that way we can somewhat match our timing. So I eventually want this to sort of come in from right to left and then bounce off the left and sort of hang here. I'm also going to add some spin into that. So this keyframe is going to stay relatively the same. This one is going to be where that square moves to, somewhere like there. And I'm actually going to copy paste that keyframe to the end here. And then at the very beginning, in fact, I could separate these elements just like we did on the circle. And here I'm animating my X position. I'll make sure I have just that one selected, and I'm going to click and drag. And if I hold Shift on my keyboard, it moves that a little faster off of the canvas here. So if I hide my circle and play this, you'll see it comes in right to left, it bounces off the left, and then it moves back. If I easy ease these, we'll get a little bit smoother animation. I'm going to jump into my graph view and make sure that this looks somewhat comparable to sort of the acceleration of my circle. This is somewhere where the speed graph can be helpful, but with position, and for our case here, it might cause a little more tedious work than is necessary. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball this here. Okay, so I'm happy with that movement, so I'm going to delete my circle now. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of spin to this. So I'm going to hit R to get my rotation property. And then by hitting U on my keyboard, I can cycle through unfolding all of the layers, none of the layers, or just the layers that have keyframes. And if I back out to my timeline, I can use this as a reference for where I want to place those things. So it'll start here. And then I think by the end here, I just want this to spin counterclockwise maybe 2 times. Let's see how that looks. And then I think I will ease these in so that it slows down at the end. Oop, it's auto-saving, that's okay. Looks pretty good, but I think I want it to be a little slower towards the end, so I'm going to give this a little more influence. Yep, that looks okay to me. So these are already in a pre-composition. If I back out to my demo here, so I have my circle scene here. I'm going to drag and drop my square scene into here. So it's a totally new layer. If I position this on top, it's in the exact same spot. What I'm actually going to do, because I want this to come in from the right and I want this transition to slide left, I'm going to come to my position property here. And I could do this from the right over here as well. And in my X positioning, I'm going to add 1920 pixels to this. What that's going to do is shift this to the right. This would be the same as dragging this position over, but just so I don't have to eyeball it, that math is going to place this exactly on the right edge here. So once this circle starts to fall, I want that next scene to sort of slide in. So I'll need this to start a little bit later. I don't want it to play through before the scene slides into position. The next thing I'm going to do is create a new null object. This is going to be essentially our camera, which controls both of these scene positions. And in order to do that, I'm going to parent both of my scenes using the pick whip onto that new null object. And then you'll see if I edit the position of this, it will control the position of both of those, which is nice so that we don't have to add position animations to everything in order to get them all to slide over. So I'll start that right about here, and then I'll just jump forward about 10 keyframes by holding Control Shift and the right arrow key. I'll add another keyframe. And then on my X position here, what I'm going to do is subtract 1920 pixels, which will shift it to the left so that our next scene comes in perfectly. If I give this some easing, go ahead and ease in on that. Let's take a look at how this looks. So you'll see that transitions in nicely. That's essentially the whole concept here. I'm going to go ahead and do one more just so you can see how you can build on that. But if you get it here, you can go ahead and dip out of the video. I'm just going to add that third scene transition. So again, I'm just going to duplicate this for a reference. I'll duplicate my square scene by copy pasting it. I'm going to name this star. And it already named it scene 3. I'll jump in there. I'm going to change my background color. Change it back to that seafoam color. And then I'll use my square positioning keyframes as reference points. Okay, I'm going to add my shape in here. I'll make sure I have nothing selected. I'll come up here to my shape tool and I will start to draw a star in. Hopefully a similar size to my square. Yours won't have as many points if you haven't used the tool before, but you can push up and down on your arrow keys to add or remove points from that polystar shape. And then if you hold Control, at least on a Windows machine, it's probably Command or Option on a Mac, it controls the depth of those points. I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to go ahead and center this up in the composition and change the color of it. And then I'm going to use those keyframes on my square as reference points. This one is going to be a little simpler. I just want this to sort of grow in. So I'm going to transform the scale of this. I'll keyframe that here. And then at the end, I want this to be at 100%. At the start, though, I want this to be at 0%. So it's going to grow in. That obviously looks very static. So I want to jump into my graph editor. I'm going to ease into this, but I'm also going to add a little bit of overshoot so it has some sort of bounce. And In order to do that, an easy way to do that without adding keyframes is to overshoot the value that you're looking for in the value graph. And I think I want this to start pretty quickly and then slow down at the end. Let's see what this looks like. It's still quite slow. That looks good. I'm also going to add some rotation into this. And just to check on that timing, maybe we'll have this rotate clockwise once. And then I'll also give that some easing. Okay, I'm going to hide my square here. It's a little fast, but that's okay. We're just using this as an example. I'll delete my square off of this. And then go back to my main composition. And we'll drop that star scene into our timeline. So our square ends its animation right about here. So this is where I want to start that next transition. I need to make sure that my new scene starts playing around here. And then I will not keyframe the position on this, but I'll first parent it to that null object so the position is controlled by that. And then I'll make sure that this composition is placed above my square scene in the space. I'm dragging it above so you can see it here. But really what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract from the Y value here if I want this to drop in from the top, just as an example. So I'll subtract 1080, and you can see it move that above here. So I will start adding keyframes to the position on my null object, jump forward 10 keyframes. And then what I'll do is move that position down by 1080. Oops, that's not enough. Yeah, I missed a key there. There we go. And you'll see that drops in from the top there. I'll just ease these. And we'll give that a preview. Okay, and that is where pre-compositions can really clean up your timeline, help you keep things in nice, tidy groups, and then you can also parent those things to null objects to control the camera movement. It also lets you create reusable objects. For example, if we wanted to transition back to that first scene, what we could do is duplicate that here or drop in another instance of it from this circle scene 1. And then any changes that we make to that pre-composition will be reflected in both instances of it in our master scene.